The roar of engines shattered the peaceful morning in Willow Creek as the Black Vultures, a ruthless biker gang, rolled into town, their leather jackets as menacing as their smirks. Frank "Red Hawk" Harris, a Vietnam veteran turned humble shopkeeper, watched in silent fury as they desecrated an American flag, his flag, burning it right outside his store. For Frank, it wasn't just a symbol, it was a reminder of blood spilled and brothers lost. Now the gang was threatening the town he'd sworn to protect, mocking the honor he'd lived his life by. Frank knew one thing for certain: these outlaws had no idea who they were messing with, and he wasn't standing alone. Before we dive into this explosive story, buckle up, get ready, and don't forget to subscribe. There's a special surprise coming your way tomorrow. Willow Creek was the kind of place where time moved slow, and the loudest sound most days was the distant clanging of the blacksmith's hammer or the chatter of kids playing stickball in the empty lot. Frank "Red Hawk" Harris had chosen this town for its peace, for the promise of quiet mornings and sunsets he could watch from the porch of his small repair shop. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The town knew Frank as a dependable man, the kind of guy who'd fix a kid's broken bike for free or lend a hand when someone's car sputtered out. They knew little of his past, and Frank preferred it that way. The shop smelled of grease and wood polish that morning as Frank finished working on an old clock brought in by Mrs. Dugan, the widowed schoolteacher. He set the clock down gently, listening to its rhythmic ticking, and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Outside, the early sun bathed Main Street in gold, the shadows still long across the uneven sidewalks, the peace shattered with the distant rumble of motorcycles. At first, Frank thought it was just passing travelers, but the noise grew louder, closer. The first bike appeared, a massive black machine with silver trim glinting in the light. It was followed by another, and then another, until a dozen roared into view, filling the street with their deafening engines. They parked haphazardly in front of stores, blocking traffic and drawing curious stares from the locals. Frank stepped out of his shop, wiping his hands on a rag, and scanned the riders. They dismounted, laughing loudly and slapping each other. On the back, their jackets bore a symbol, a vulture clutching a skull, and the words, "Black Vultures MC." They swaggered into the diner across the street, and within moments, the sound of shattering glass and raised voices spilled into the morning air. Frank's jaw tightened as he noticed the other shopkeepers. They were peering out from behind doors and curtains, their faces marked with unease. This town wasn't built for trouble, and trouble had rolled in on two wheels. Moments later, the bikers poured back into the street, their boisterous laughter louder than before. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, grabbed an American flag hanging outside the hardware store. He yanked it down, tossing it to the ground, and another biker lit it with a lighter. Flames licked at the edges, and the group cheered as the flag burned. Frank's heart pounded as he stepped forward, rag clenched in his hand. "Hey!" His voice cut through the noise, and the group turned to look at him. The scarred man smirked, his eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, old man." Frank held their gaze, his face stern, but he didn't answer. The silence hung heavy before the scarred man laughed and shoved Frank backward. "Didn't think so." Frank staggered but didn't fall. As the bikers roared with laughter and mounted their bikes, Frank straightened, his mind already working. Trouble had come to Willow Creek, but trouble had no idea who it was dealing with. Frank sat in his dimly lit shop that night, the smell of charred fabric still lingering in his nostrils. The sight of the burning flag replayed in his mind, each flicker of the flames stoking the fire in his chest. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from restrained anger, as he stared at the framed photograph on his workbench, a younger version of himself, flanked by the men of his old unit, all grinning despite the dirt and blood smeared across their faces. Some of them were gone now, their lives lost in jungles far from home. The memory of their sacrifices mingled with the humiliation. He'd felt that morning, turning his frustration into resolve. The next day, the town woke to an unsettling silence. The Black Vultures weren't content with a single show of force. Their motorcycles thundered down Main Street every few hours, a reminder of their presence. Businesses that refused to pay. Their protection fees found windows smashed or shelves overturned. At the diner, Mary Ann, the waitress, came out of her shift in tears, her arm bruised from an unwelcome grab by one of the bikers. People whispered about calling the sheriff, but the nearest station was 2 towns away, and no one believed the law would arrive before the bikers were done. Frank walked to the general store that afternoon, his expression hard as he passed the burned patch of pavement where the flag had fallen. Inside, he found Tom Grizzly Porter on the other end of the line, his deep, gravelly voice a balm to Frank's frayed nerves. "Red Hawk, hell, I thought you were calling to tell me you finally retired." "Not even close," Frank replied, his voice steady but heavy. He hesitated before continuing. "I've got a situation here, Grizzly. Some bikers rolled into town. They're terrorizing folks, burning flags, pushing people around. I can't let it slide." Grizzly's tone grew serious. "Sounds like they bit off more than they can chew." "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Frank exhaled, leaning on the counter. "I can't do it alone." "You won't have to," Grizzly said without hesitation. "Give me a day or 2, I'll spread the word." By evening, Frank was back in his shop, clearing space and rummaging through old crates. His hands brushed against a battered trunk, its lock rusted but still intact. He pried it open, revealing a collection of relics from a life he thought he'd left behind. A set of fatigues, a knife with a worn leather sheath, and a stack of maps marked with faded pencil. The next morning, the sound of an approaching truck rumbled down the road. Frank stepped outside as Grizzly climbed out, his imposing figure as solid as ever, despite his graying hair. "You called, I came," Grizzly said with a grin, "and I brought reinforcements." Frank looked past him as more vehicles appeared, each carrying men who moved with a quiet confidence. They weren't just friends, they were brothers, ready to stand by him once again. By midday, the quiet town of Willow Creek was alive with murmurs as more trucks and SUVs arrived. Men stepped out, some wearing faded military jackets, others carrying duffel bags slung over their shoulders. They greeted each other with firm handshakes, gruff laughs, and the kind of unspoken camaraderie that only came from shared battlefields. Frank stood at the center of it all, watching as his old brothers-in-arms rallied to his call. Tom Grizzly Porter wasted no time. "All right, Red Hawk," he said, slapping a hand on Frank's shoulder. "What's the plan?" Frank nodded, toward the shop. "We set up a base here. I've got tools, maps, and enough room for gear. First, we figure out what these guys want, and cut them off before they can dig in any deeper." The veterans filed into the shop, their presence a stark contrast to the meek air of the town. The energy shifted as they began unpacking, their movements precise and purposeful. One of them, a wiry man named Carl Ghost Watson, spread out. A map of the town across the counter. "I scouted the outskirts on my way in," Ghost said. "Looks like the bikers are camping near the old quarry. Plenty of cover for them. But they're overconfident. No sentries, no perimeter set up. They think no one's going to push back." "That's their first mistake," Grizzly said with a smirk. Frank ran a hand over his stubbled chin, nodding slowly. "We need to show them this town isn't an easy target, but we can't go in guns blazing. We're not here to get anyone hurt. First we cut off their resources, make them feel boxed in." The plan came together quickly. The veterans split into small teams, each assigned a task. Some went to sabotage the bikers' motorcycles, sneaking into their camp under cover of darkness to drain fuel tanks and cut ignition wires. Others planted road spikes along the gang's escape routes, ensuring they'd have no easy way out when the time came. The veterans worked with military precision, their movements swift and coordinated. In the dead of night, Grizzly and another veteran named Big Joe crept through the camp, careful to avoid the bikers passed out around a fire. Joe produced a pair of wire cutters, and within minutes, the gang's best bikes were rendered useless. Back in town, Frank stayed behind to keep an eye on Main Street, walking the quiet roads with a watchful eye. He caught sight of Mary Ann, the diner waitress, peering out her window. She gave him a small wave, her face still marked with worry. Frank tipped his hat in return, silently promising her that things would change. By morning, the Black Vultures were scrambling. Engines sputtered and died as they tried to start their bikes. Snake stormed around the camp, his voice booming with frustration as he barked orders at his men. Meanwhile, the veterans regrouped. At the shop, their faces grim but determined. It wasn't over yet, but the first blow had been struck. The chaos at the Black Vulture's camp spilled into the town as Snake and his men stormed into Willow Creek, their frustration visible in their clenched fists and narrowed eyes. The sound of sputtering motorcycles had been replaced with angry shouts and threats, their swagger now laced with desperation. For the first time since their arrival, the gang didn't seem untouchable. Frank watched them from the shadows of his shop, his hand resting on the old knife he'd taken from his trunk. The sight of Snake, his leather jacket emblazoned with the vulture emblem, lit a fire in Frank's gut. He stayed calm, though. This wasn't the time to strike. They'd rattled the cage, but the real fight was still to come. Inside the shop, Grizzly and the others were strategizing. Ghost pointed to the map on the counter. "We hit their fuel stash next. It's at the edge of the quarry, away from their camp. They've got barrels of it. We take that out, they're stranded." "Good," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "We keep them guessing. Let them think we're everywhere, like shadows." As the sun set, the team moved out again. Frank stayed behind to keep an eye on the town, his presence reassuring to the nervous shopkeepers who peeked out from their windows. He stopped by the diner where Mary Ann handed him a thermos of coffee. "You think this'll work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded, his expression resolute. "It's already working. They're scared." Mary Ann managed a small smile. "Good. About time someone made them feel that way." Meanwhile, at the quarry, the veterans moved like ghosts. Grizzly and Big Joe rolled a barrel of fuel into the nearby woods, while Ghost rigged the others with small charges. They worked quickly, their movements precise. Within an hour, they were gone, leaving behind a faint trail of destruction. The explosion rocked the night, sending a fireball into the sky that could be seen from the town. Snake's roar of frustration echoed through the streets as the gang realized their lifeline had been cut. They stomped through Main Street, kicking over trash cans and banging on shop doors. Snake stopped in front of Frank's shop, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can mess with us and get away with it?" he bellowed. He kicked the door, rattling the frame but not breaking through. Inside, Frank stood just out of sight, his grip on the knife tightening. He heard the bikers laughing, their bravado masking their unease. When they finally left, Frank stepped into the moonlit street and looked down at the scuff marks on his door. Back at the shop, the veterans regrouped, their faces grim but determined. They'd done what they set out to do, but the gang was getting more desperate by the hour. Frank looked at his brothers, his voice steady as he spoke. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." The tension in Willow Creek was palpable as the sun rose the next morning. Shopkeepers opened their doors cautiously, their eyes darting down the street for any sign of the Black Vultures. The once peaceful town was now a powder keg, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Frank sat on the porch of his shop, sipping coffee from a dented thermos and watching the street with an unflinching gaze. The veterans had regrouped inside, reviewing the results of their last strike. Ghost's detailed account of the fuel explosion brought a few smirks, but the mood was far from celebratory. "They're reeling," Ghost said, pointing to their positions on the map. "But a cornered animal's the most dangerous kind. They'll hit back hard." "Let them try," Grizzly grunted. He was sharpening a hunting knife, the sound of metal on stone punctuating his words. "They're scared, but they're angry," Frank said, his voice steady. "That makes them unpredictable. We need to keep the pressure on. Next move has to shake them to their core." Frank's suggestion was simple. They would target the gang's leadership. Without Snake's direction, the Black Vultures would be little more than a group of disorganized thugs. Ghost had spotted Snake's personal bike parked in front of the saloon on the outskirts of town, and Frank saw an opportunity. That night, the veterans moved in silence, slipping through the shadows like they had decades ago in the jungles of Vietnam. The saloon was poorly guarded, its few watchmen distracted by the noise and alcohol inside. Frank led the way, his knife glinting in the faint moonlight as he crept towards Snake's bike. Grizzly kept watch near the entrance, while Big Joe and Ghost worked to disable the bike. Within minutes, the gas tank was drained and the ignition system was dismantled. Before leaving, Frank placed a folded American flag on the bike's seat, its edges singed from the gang's earlier vandalism. By the time Snake emerged from the saloon, the veterans were long gone. He froze when he saw the flag, his face twisting with rage. His furious shouts echoed into the night as he kicked the bike over, smashing the flag beneath his boot. The next morning, Snake and his men stormed into town, tearing through the streets. On the few bikes that still worked, they banged on doors, demanding to know who was behind the sabotage. The townsfolk remained silent, their fear tempered by the quiet confidence they saw in Frank and his team. Snake stopped in front of Frank's shop once again, his voice dripping with menace. "I know it's you, old man," he snarled. "You think you're tough, you think you can take us on." Frank stepped out onto the porch, his face calm but unyielding. "I don't think," he said evenly. "I know." For a moment, there was silence. Then Snake mounted his bike and sped off, his fury barely contained. The gang's retaliation was coming, but Frank and his brothers were ready. The retaliation came at night. Willow Creek was cloaked in uneasy silence when the Black Vultures roared back into town like a thunderstorm. They didn't stop to talk or make demands this time. Instead, they unleashed their fury, smashing windows, overturning trash bins, and setting fires wherever they could. The sky glowed an eerie orange as flames consumed the hardware store and licked at the edges of the diner. Frank and the veterans had prepared for an attack, but even they hadn't expected such reckless destruction. From the shadows of his shop, Frank watched the chaos unfold, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and guilt. He had known pushing the gang would escalate things, but seeing his town burn was a hard pill to swallow. "Red Hawk," Grizzly said, his voice low as he joined Frank at the window. "We can't let this go on." Frank nodded, his jaw clenched. "We won't, but we stick to the plan. No one moves unless I say so. The people come first." Inside the shop, the other veterans were ready. Big Joe held a fire extinguisher, ready to douse any flames that got too close, while Ghost kept a keen eye on the street, tracking the gang's movements. The townsfolk, fearful but determined, had begun working together to put out the fires. Buckets of water passed from hand to hand as small groups gathered to defend their homes and businesses. As the gang moved deeper into town, Snake dismounted his bike and strode toward the center of the street, his leather boots crunching on broken glass. His voice boomed through the night as he called out, "Come on, old man! Where's that fight you're so proud of? Show me what you've got!" Frank stepped out onto the porch of his shop, his silhouette framed by the flickering light of the fires. Snake grinned when he saw him, a cruel, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You got guts, I'll give you that," Snake said, spreading his arms theatrically. "But guts won't save this town." Frank took a slow step forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't your town. It's ours, and you're not welcome here." Snake's smile faltered just for a second. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "Big words for one man against a dozen." Frank's lips tightened into a thin line. "Who said I was alone?" At that moment, Grizzly and Ghost emerged from the shadows behind Frank, their faces as hard as stone. From the rooftops, a few of the younger townsfolk, armed with slingshots and rocks, made their presence known, launching a volley that shattered the streetlights. The sudden darkness disoriented the gang, giving the veterans and townsfolk a brief advantage. The bikers regrouped quickly, but Snake's composure was gone. He barked orders, trying to restore control, but it was clear the tide was turning. This was no longer a town cowering in fear. This was a community standing its ground, and Frank wasn't about to let them back down now. The morning after the gang's rampage, the damage to Willow Creek was painfully clear. The hardware store was a smoldering ruin, its once sturdy walls blackened and collapsed. The diner's windows had been shattered, and deep tire marks scarred the streets. Townsfolk gathered in small clusters, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Frank stood in front of his shop, surveying the destruction. His heart ached for the town he had come to love. He glanced at Mary Ann, who was sweeping broken glass. From the diner's front steps, she paused to wipe a tear from her cheek, but kept working. The sight reminded Frank of why he had called his brothers in the first place. This town wasn't just a place to him anymore, it was home. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was tense. Grizzly leaned against the counter, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Ghost paced near the map, his expression grim. Big Joe sat in a corner, his head bowed as he tied and retied his boots. The previous Night's battle had been a small victory, but the cost was starting to weigh on everyone. "We've got them scared," Grizzly said finally, breaking the silence. "But that stunt they pulled last night? They're not just scared, they're mad." Frank nodded slowly. "That's what worries me. They're not going to let this go." Ghost slammed his fist on the counter, startling everyone. "We're outnumbered, Red Hawk. We've been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever. We need a new plan." Frank's face darkened. He knew Ghost was right. They'd been fighting smart, but the gang's sheer numbers were starting to take their toll. The veterans were feeling it too. Age and old wounds were catching up with them, slowing their movements and shortening their endurance. Big Joe had taken a nasty fall during the skirmish, and his limp was worse than ever. "We can't let them push us out," Frank said, his voice firm despite the doubt creeping into his heart. "If we back down now, they'll destroy everything." Grizzly sighed and shook his head. "We're not backing down, but we need more help. This isn't just our fight. The townsfolk need to step up." Frank hesitated, knowing the risk of involving civilians, but he also knew Grizzly was right. That evening he called a meeting at the town hall. It was packed with wary faces, people clutching their hats and whispering nervously. Frank stood at the front, his hands resting on the podium. "I know you're scared," he began, his voice steady. "I am too, but this town isn't theirs to take, it's ours. We've already shown them we won't be bullied. Now we need to show them what real strength looks like, together." The room was silent for a moment before Mary Ann stepped forward, her chin high. "What do you need us to do?" One by one, others joined her. The fear in their eyes hadn't disappeared, but it was joined by something stronger, resolve. As Frank looked out at the crowd, he felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just standing up for themselves, they were standing up for each other. The town hall became a hive of activity as Frank and his brothers-in-arms worked with the townsfolk to organize their defenses. Mary Ann and a group of younger women began assembling first aid kits, gathering supplies from the pharmacy that had miraculously avoided the gang's destruction. The farmers brought tools, chains, and scrap metal that could be repurposed for barricades. The blacksmith worked tirelessly, reforging rusted nails and old metal scraps into makeshift weapons. Frank stood at the center of it all, coordinating efforts with Grizzly and Ghost. His voice carried across the room as he gave directions, his calm authority cutting through the nervous chatter. For the first time, the town wasn't cowering, it was preparing to fight. Out on Main Street, the veterans began teaching the townsfolk basic defense tactics. Big Joe demonstrated how to use crowbars and shovels for leverage, while Ghost showed a group of teenagers how to set up tripwires using fishing line and old tin cans. The blacksmith hammered away at iron spikes to reinforce the barricades being built at key entry points. Frank pulled Mary Ann aside as the preparations continued. "You've done more than enough," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "When the fighting starts, I want you and the others who can't fight to stay safe." She crossed her arms and glared at him. "You think we're just going to hide while you risk everything? This is our town, too." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but saw the determination in her eyes. He nodded reluctantly. "All right, but promise me you'll stay back. Only get involved if it's absolutely necessary." Mary Ann softened, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll do what we have to, Frank. Same as you." As night fell, the barricades were completed, and the townsfolk gathered in small groups, their faces pale but resolute. Frank stood at the barricade on the edge of town, the stars overhead stark and cold against the darkness. Grizzly joined him, lighting a cigar and exhaling a plume of smoke. "Think they'll hit tonight?" Grizzly asked. "They're running out of patience," Frank replied. "And options. They'll come." Grizzly nodded, taking another drag. "Hell of a thing, isn't it? Us back in the fight after all these years." Frank's lips curled into a faint smile. "We never really left it, did we?" The two men stood in silence for a moment before Ghost's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "Movement near. The North Road. Looks like it's starting." Frank turned to the assembled group. "Positions," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. The townsfolk and veterans moved into place, their makeshift weapons at the ready. Frank took his position at the barricade, his grip tight on the crowbar in his hands. He glanced over his shoulder at the faces around him, a mix of fear and determination. In the distance, the roar of engines shattered the night. The Black Vultures were coming, and this time, the town was ready. The roar of the engines grew louder, vibrating through the barricades and the ground beneath Frank's boots. The townsfolk behind him shifted nervously, gripping their tools and weapons with white-knuckled hands. Grizzly stood nearby, his cigar extinguished, his knife gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Ghost was stationed on a rooftop overlooking the barricade, a walkie-talkie clipped to his vest, his sharp eyes scanning the approaching headlights. "Hold your ground," Frank called out, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "They want us to break first. Don't give them the satisfaction." The first bikes appeared at the edge of the road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Snake led the pack, his silhouette unmistakable as he revved his engine and raised his arm. The gang came to a stop just short of the barricade, their machines growling like predators waiting to strike. Snake dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. His men spread out behind him, their faces twisted with cocky grins and malicious intent. Snake stopped a few feet from the barricade, his leather jacket catching the flicker of the torches the townsfolk had lit. "Well, well," Snake drawled, his voice loud enough to carry over the rumble of the bikes. "You've been busy, old man. Gotta say, I'm impressed. But let's be real. You think this little pile of junk is gonna stop us?" Frank stepped forward, his shoulders squared and his gaze locked on Snake. "It's not the barricade I should be worried about. It's the people behind it." Snake's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, laughing. "Tough talk, but I see a bunch of scared little sheep. You can't win this, Harris. You're outnumbered, outmatched, and way out of your depth." Frank's grip on his crowbar tightened. "Then come and prove it." Snake's face twisted into a sneer as he waved his arm. "Take it down." The bikers surged forward, engines roaring as they charged the barricade. The first bike hit the makeshift wall, only to be stopped dead as spikes hidden beneath the debris punctured the tires. The rider was thrown over the handlebars, landing hard on the ground. "Now!" Frank shouted. The townsfolk sprang into action. From the rooftops, Ghost and a few others unleashed a hail of rocks and debris, forcing the gang to scatter. At ground level, Grizzly led a group armed with heavy tools, using them to push back any biker who got too close. Snake, seeing his men falter, drew a knife and charged the barricade himself. Frank met him head-on, their weapons clashing in the flickering light. Snake was fast, but Frank's movements were deliberate and precise, honed by years of experience. Around them, the gang's momentum faltered. Bikes lay scattered, their engines silent. The townsfolk pressed their advantage, driving the gang further back with every step. Snake's sneer turned to desperation as he realized his men were losing ground. For the first time, it wasn't just a fight, it was a rout. The Black Vultures were being pushed out, and Snake's control was slipping. But the fight wasn't over yet. The battle in Willow Creek intensified as the Black Vultures fought desperately to regain control. The gang was used to intimidation, not resistance, and the sight of townsfolk holding their ground sent a ripple of uncertainty through their ranks. The bikers' initial charge had been met with well-placed traps and a unified front, and now their numbers were dwindling. Frank and Snake circled each other near the barricade, their weapons poised and their expressions locked in grim determination. Snake lunged first, his knife flashing in the firelight as he struck out. Frank sidestepped, swinging his crowbar and forcing Snake to backpedal. The clash was brutal, each strike and parry a testament to their resolve. Nearby, Grizzly roared as he swung a heavy wrench, knocking one of the bikers off balance and sending him sprawling. Ghost moved like a shadow, slipping between the chaos to take out another biker's legs with a well-timed sweep. The townsfolk fought with a mix of fear and fury, defending their home with everything they had. "Don't let up!" Frank shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They're breaking!" He wasn't wrong. The gang's movements were becoming sloppy, their confidence unraveling with every setback. Several of them had already abandoned their bikes and fled into the night, leaving Snake and a handful of loyal followers to face the growing resistance. Snake's frustration boiled over as he charged at Frank again, his knife slicing through the air. This time, Frank met the attack head-on, using the crowbar to block the strike before shoving Snake back with his shoulder. Snake stumbled, but his fury only seemed to grow. "You don't get it, do you?" Snake spat, his voice venomous. "This town belongs to us now. You can't change that." Frank didn't respond with words. Instead, he stepped forward, his crowbar swinging in a wide arc that knocked the knife from Snake's hand. It clattered to the ground, and Snake froze for a split second, his confidence finally faltering. Behind him, the remaining bikers were overwhelmed. The townsfolk's resolve had turned the tide, and the gang was retreating, their morale shattered. Ghost radioed in from his position on a rooftop. "They're falling back, Red Hawk. Looks like this fight's ours." Frank kept his eyes on Snake, who was breathing heavily, his fists clenched but empty. "It's over," Frank said, his voice steady. "Call your men off and leave." Snake's face twisted with rage, but he could see the writing on the wall. Slowly, he raised his hands and stepped back. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." Frank lowered the crowbar, but kept it at the ready. "Not as much as you'll regret coming here in the first place, as the last." Of the gang retreated. The fires in Willow Creek began to die down, and the sound of engines faded into the distance. The townsfolk stood together, bruised and battered, but victorious. They had defended their home, and for the first time in days, the air was filled not with fear, but with hope. The dust began to settle over Willow Creek as the black vultures fled into the night, their engines fading into the distance. The town was battered and bruised, but it still stood. Frank lowered his crowbar, letting out a slow breath as the adrenaline began to drain from his body. Around him, the townsfolk emerged from their positions, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and cautious relief. Grizzly approached, wiping blood from a cut above his brow. "They're gone," he said, his voice gruff. "For now, anyway." Frank nodded, his eyes scanning the streets. Fires had been extinguished, but the damage was stark. The hardware store was a blackened shell, and other shops bore scars of shattered windows and broken doors. Still, the people were intact, and the unity they'd shown in the fight gave Frank hope. The veterans regrouped near the barricade, their movement slower now as the wear and tear of the battle caught up with them. Big Joe leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, his face pale but determined. Ghost crouched near a broken motorcycle, his hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. Frank glanced over at the townsfolk, many of whom were tending to each other's wounds or helping to clear debris. Mary Ann approached him, a rag in one, and a determined look on her face. "You all right?" she asked, her gaze searching his for signs of injury. "I'm fine," Frank replied, his voice steady but weary. "How about you?" She nodded. "We're alive. That's what matters." She hesitated, then added, "You gave us a chance to fight back. Don't think we'll forget that." Before Frank could respond, Ghost's voice cut through the moment. "Snake's still here." Frank turned sharply. Ghost pointed to the alley behind the general store, where Snake was slumped against the wall, clutching his side. His knife was gone, and the sneer he'd worn so proudly had been replaced by a mask of pain and defeat. Frank approached slowly, the crowbar still in his hand. Snake looked up, his eyes filled with hatred but also a flicker of something else. "Fear. You've lost," Frank said, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't your town, and it never will be." Snake spat blood onto the ground, his voice hoarse. "You think you've won? This place isn't worth fighting for. It's a dead-end town just like you." Frank didn't rise to the bait. He tossed the crowbar to the ground, the clang echoing through the alley. "This town isn't perfect," he said, "but it's ours, and we'll fight for it every time someone like you comes along." Snake struggled to his feet, his hand pressed to his side. Frank motioned for the sheriff, who had finally arrived after receiving word of the battle. "Take him," Frank said. The sheriff cuffed Snake and led him away. As Snake was dragged past the townsfolk, they stood tall, their silence a powerful statement. Frank watched him go, knowing the fight was over, for now, but Willow Creek would be ready for whatever came next. The morning after the fight, the town was quiet, save for the sounds of hammers and saws as the rebuilding began. Willow Creek bore the scars of the battle, but there was a new energy in the air, a sense of unity and resilience that hadn't been there before. The townsfolk worked side by side, repairing broken windows, clearing debris, and salvaging what they could. Frank stood in front of his shop looking at the burned patch of ground where the first flag had been torched. He held a new flag in his hands, the fabric crisp and clean, its colors bright against the pale morning light. As he raised it on the same pole, the townsfolk paused to watch. When the flag reached the top and began to ripple in the breeze, a quiet cheer spread through the crowd. Mary Ann walked up beside Frank, her hands dusted with flour from baking loaves of bread for the workers. "Looks good up there," she said, her voice soft but warm. Frank nodded. "It does." He glanced at her. "You did good, Mary Ann. All of you did. This town didn't just survive, it fought back." She smiled, the lines of worry on her face softening. "You gave us the courage to stand up. That's not something we'll forget." Inside the shop, the veterans were packing up. Big Joe uncarefully loaded supplies into his truck while Grizzly leaned on the counter, savoring the last bit of coffee from a dented thermos. Ghost was folding up the map they'd used to plan their strikes, his movements slow but precise. "So what now?" Grizzly asked, looking at Frank. "Now we go back to our lives," Frank said. "This town's theirs to protect now. They've earned it." Grizzly smirked. "You think we'll ever get called in again?" Frank chuckled faintly. "Hope not. But if we do, you know where to find me." The veterans said their goodbyes, in their own understated way. A clap on the shoulder here, a firm handshake there. By noon, their trucks were rumbling down the road, leaving Frank standing alone in front of his shop. As the sun climbed higher, Frank watched the townsfolk continue their work. He saw the blacksmith reinforcing the hardware store's frame, the farmers hauling lumber to patch the diner's roof, and the children sweeping the sidewalks clean of ash and debris. The town was healing, and it was stronger than ever. That evening, as the last light of day faded into the horizon, Frank sat on the porch of his shop with a cup of coffee in hand. The new flag waved proudly above him, a symbol of everything they'd fought for. A boy from the town approached shyly, holding a piece of paper. "This is for you, Mr. Harris," the boy said, handing it over. Frank unfolded the paper, revealing a hand-drawn picture of the flag with the words, "Thank you for saving us," scrawled beneath it. Frank's throat tightened as he looked at the boy, then back at the flag. "No," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you.